Two, one.
We're rolling, Dave, right? We can take it away.
Yep, over to you.
Okay. So I don't know if there's a fancy intro. I'm David Darkangelo. I work for Susquehanna International Group. It's a trading firm outside of suburban Philadelphia. I work in the commodities team there as their meteorologist, forecasting for energy, specifically natural gas, electricity, and renewables. We dabble a little bit in agricultural commodities as well. So it tends to be forward-looking forecast from just basically day ahead forecasts to weeks to months in the future. Maybe make some commentary on the seasonal at times, but a lot of the focus for my job is kind of in the 1 to say 3 week out time frame. So this subseasonal contest fits nicely in that. So I think today maybe I'll review a little bit about where we've been. Ask for some insight into that. I don't have, Dave, I may end up flipping back to you if you wanted to show verification for this period.
Sure.
I think we're verifying for the 24th to the 28th of February. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, so that what we see there is that's the verification map. And it was obviously a marked contrast to the period prior to that. This was not just the tail end, but the complete reversal of what was one of the coldest middle of the country stretches in winter we've seen in quite a long time, in particular for the South Central states, perhaps the coldest stretch of any winter month since 1989. I'll roll back to that here briefly, just as a reminder. I think that previous week was the verification would have been the 17th to the 21st. And this is there is the verification for that. And obviously the the extreme cold in the Midwest and Texas was a quick and sudden reversal, at the end of the month. And the verification period that we're working with today that we just verified is obviously that period, which was the reemergence of a warm eastern half of the country and a cold, mostly interior west. So we verified with below normal HDDs nationally, and in what is one of the more sharp reversals in recent years from cold snaps. But it's something that we've seen, some tendency to do. Cold snaps that we had in January of 2019, and then late December, early January 17, 18, were marked by quick reversals as well. So one of the hallmarks of the last, say, half decade has been any cold snap is unable to be maintained past, say, the 3 week time frame. And although this one in particular, February of 2021, will go down as perhaps one of the most severe, it still had a sudden reversal towards warmth. It seems like a lot of what we saw in the last couple of weeks was a return to a La Nina-ish base state. And I think that's fairly well demonstrated by looking at not the Wheeler-Hendon of the MJO, but maybe a bit of a surrogate of that. And I like to look at 200 millibar velocity potential. And what we're seeing here is the verification of the 200 millibar velocity potential centered around the equator for the period back to the end of December. And then everything below this black line is the European forecast for the next 2 weeks. I think this is a nice demonstration of kind of where we've come from, where we are today, perhaps, and what we might be looking into for the next couple of 3 weeks. So to recap, we saw in the first half of winter, and you can see that at the top here with this concentration of convection, which was centered over basically Indonesia and the far Western Pacific, which is kind of a real strong marker of the La Nina base state. And while the temperatures across North America didn't exactly exhibit true La Nina type correlations, we saw a relatively warm North America for the first half of winter with the establishment early on late last fall of that La Nina base state. Around the third week in January here, there's the 19th of January, and you can see that it was a fairly abrupt ending to this strong positive convection across Indonesia, and then obviously relative sinking motion with the cold water in the Eastern Pacific. That ended abruptly in late January, the latter third or so. We saw a breakdown of that convective signal, and the convection took up residence much more towards the Central Eastern Pacific. And it looked like that transition, coupled with some of what we had seen in the stratosphere going back to December, was a pretty large assist towards migrating the vortex towards the North America side of the pole. We had seen it take up residence in Asia in late December, Europe in early January, and then the migration of this convection away from Indonesia towards the Eastern Pacific was a fairly large signature that the North American North Pacific wave train was on the move, and we saw the resultant mid-February response towards extreme cold in the middle of North America. But look what's happened recently. Since about mid-February, which is when the cold was peaking in Texas, we saw the reestablishment of convection over the far Western Pacific and then Eastern Indonesia in roughly the same place that we had seen it leading up to, say, mid-January. In response, obviously, too, there was a relatively tranquil sinking motion over the Eastern Pacific, South America, and the Atlantic, and it has much more characteristics of something that we had seen for the first half of winter. So it's not, in a sense, a huge surprise that we had seen the decay of that cold, but the response itself was quite rapid. Dave, I'm going to turn this over to you for a moment. You want me to stop sharing? I'd like to kind of go through the verification briefly.
Sure, no problem.
Go ahead.
All right, let's see here. Sure. And I'll pull up the right one. Now let me go back. All right, there you go.
There we go. Great. So this was a challenging week because I think when we were making this forecast on the 9th of February, we were kind of at the very cusp of what was looking like a rather severe cold outbreak for the next 10 or 12 days. There was some relaxation, as I recall, towards the end of model space. But the big question mark when I think we made this forecast on the 9th of February was, what was the transition going to look like? Were we going to go from severe cold to warm? We're going to go from severe cold to something that was less severe. And I think that there was potentially some challenges going forward with the forecast. I think the verification's at the bottom, if I think, and we came in at 120. There we go.
Yeah, there's the verification
104.
104, and then I just sorted it by performance. Just
perfect. So 104 was the number, which was I don't think anybody was in that ballpark. Josh Herman had a 118, and he briefed us a few weeks ago on his theory of the recurring Rossby wave train, and I think he had a warm forecast for the week prior to this, which had poor verification. But for him, it looked like more a question of timing. But the idea was correct, and that's something that we frequently talk about in the subseasonal space, is that you get the trajectory of the forecast right, even if you miss the timing. So I guess I'm willing to give him some benefit of the doubt and credit him with a very good forecast this week. Paul Roundy was in that category as well. And obviously the 30-day persistence and the 10-year normal was also up there as well. It seemed like a lot of us, though, did struggle with this transition. It's tough coming out of severe periods, whether you're coming out of extreme cold and going towards something that's kind of quote unquote less cold, or if you're coming out similarly of a period that's extremely warm. The past few winters, one of the struggles has been to transition into cold patterns, because it's challenging when you're looking at a forecast for the next, say, 10 or 12 or 14 days that's so exceptionally warm. It's challenging to imagine kind of like what's kind of beyond the horizon, what's just over the horizon, because it's unlikely that the ensembles at, say, day 15 will kind of offer the strong clues that you'd be looking for to make a big stand. So I think this was overall a challenging verification, because not just from this timing standpoint, but then also to get the ripping magnitude of when it ended up being a very warm period. Dave, anything else stand out to you when you kind of look at this verification?
Actually, I have a related question, if you don't mind. It's more of a market question, and I really don't know, but I'm sure you will.
Sure.
So we saw obviously a massive pattern change to cold, if you will, back in February, and then a pretty significant pattern change to warm here. From a market perspective, can you provide any context in terms of how the market responded both to the cold and warm? Like, was the response, in terms of price movement, whether it be gas or some of the power, was it greater in the move up, greater in the move down, that kind of thing?
Let me answer that in two parts, Dave. One is that there's sometimes a specific response to the electricity markets, and then a different and sometimes not just opposite response, but sometimes just a different response in the gas markets. In the electricity markets, which will be short term and tend to be much more kind of quote unquote on demand, we saw massive spikes in the central United States with regards to that, which was true in terms of not just the magnitude of the cold, but the need that they would have for electricity. From a gas standpoint, when we think about gas on a national level, there's a big difference of whether you get cold at the forefront of winter, say in November, December, versus the later part of winter. So the response in the gas market to this, despite it being an extreme event, was much more muted than you might say if you got a similar event in the middle of December. The fear of quote unquote running out of gas or getting gas to be depleted before you go into the summer season is much less, knowing that the previous 10 or 12 weeks have been very mild. So the winter kind of built us a bit of a cushion, so to speak. And there was a response in the gas market, don't get me wrong, but it was much more muted because of the timing of that, timing of this event. And then also too, the response was strong, but then there was this anticipation, I think in the market, correctly so, that we were going to return to some kind of quote unquote milder period. So it would have been a much different response had in the middle of the cold outbreak, Dave, say on the 15th, 16th, and 17th of February, had we been looking at another 15 days of below average temperatures and above normal national demand. But that wasn't true. By the time we reached the peak of the cold wave in Texas, we were already kind of seeing into the forecast and looking forward towards milder weather. So that again provided another piece of evidence towards cushioning the blow on the back end of that. So the response is muted, and a lot of it is just timing of the time of year that it occurred on.
Got it. So if this had occurred in, middle of December, it could have been a much bigger move up.
Absolutely. It might have been a substantially higher move from the standpoint that you just don't know what kind of cold you might get in January, February, and March. It was also easy to say in mid-February, well, we won't see another cold outbreak like this in March. Not only will we not see another cold outbreak similar to this, but all the other things being equal, we're on the very, very tail end of winter. And national demand has moved away from Texas strongly in March in the southern United States. So even if we had been sort of colder than average in March in Texas, knowing that we weren't going to get anything close to this magnitude, what's a cold day in Dallas in mid-March? It's probably, 40s and 50s, right. Which really doesn't bring on a lot of demand. So yeah, timing was a big part of this. But don't get me wrong, it was still a substantial event and something that will have some repercussions, as we look forward into the next few seasons.
Cool. The only other weather-related item that I can think of in here, if you're having trouble finding my forecast, it's because it's way at the bottom. But I remember, obviously I was thinking more persistence, but I was trying to think of something that's a little bit more relevant to kind of lesson learned type thing. And I remember, I think Matt Rogers and I were talking about the AO. Let me see if I still have it. I just wanted to ask you about this too, or maybe I can pull it up. AO is always easy to find, right? CPC. And I remember Matt and I talking about, talking about this verification, this sharp move up from a negative AO, which, by the way, right, as Michael, who's on the line, has talked about much of the winter, we had this negative AO for a good chunk of the winter, well before it actually got cold. But then this massive movement. And I remember Matt and I saying, well, it looks suspicious, right? Well, whether it looks suspicious or not, like it verified, right? And the models, obviously, well, the long range models did not do a good job capturing it. The shorter range models up here did a much better job at capturing it. I know this is not an easy question. I don't necessarily expect you to have a great answer for this. I don't. But any thoughts as to what caused this rapid retreat of the negative AO? What drove that? Like stratospheric, MJO, synoptics. Any thoughts on that?
That's for me, Dave, right? To comment on?
Yeah, or anyone, but I'm starting with Dave.
So I don't think I have a great answer. I started this off by talking about some of the shifts in the low frequency forcing in the Pacific. There was clearly a response in mid-February back towards a La Nina base state, which would favor a positive AO. But yes, that's not the only thing. I think it may be worthy of a bit of a research study if someone wanted to take it on, is when you see these kind of massive drops in AO, and I'm not talking about the trend since December, I'm talking about specifically the mid-February period. What is the snapback response to that?
Right.
Because there's an impression that we have in the last couple of decades that when we get large responses in mid-latitude cold as a result of something like the AO or NAO, that it can't hold, right? I mentioned this at the outset, which is that we've had cold periods before the last 3 or 4 winters. They tend to be brief. This one was obviously severe, but the response has always been towards a quicker rebound towards warm. And I think I'd like to know if somebody could go in and maybe do a little bit of a research study as to what's the tendency of that over, say, the last couple of 3 decades versus the period from, say, the 1960s to the mid 1980s. My impression is that these snapbacks are occurring with greater frequency and they're much stronger, but I haven't looked at the data to back that up.
Yeah, well, to that point, I know I just saw something. I'm on the UAlbany thread, and one of the folks on there, I can't remember who, but published something about the amount of 850, looking at the size of 850 temperatures below like a certain threshold. I think it was like -5 this winter, and it was one of the lowest, like in other words, warmest. Like you didn't have that much severe. And he drew up a time series daily, and it was really interesting that during the spike of cold in the central United States, this kind of fits with a little bit what you're talking about. That despite the fact that obviously it got extremely cold in that longitude band of near Houston and Dallas, for the northern hemisphere as a whole, it was actually a rapid retreat of 850 temperatures. In other words, that was the big cold pool that got spent into or dispersed into Texas, but then there wasn't a lot left to replace it. So despite the fact that a small section of the northern hemisphere was seeing extreme cold, there was a lot of other areas that were starting to move in a different direction.
That's true, David. And you and I think have shared some research in the last decade or so, which has not looked at 850 temperatures, but looked at the strength of a surface and expansiveness of the surface high. So in this case, we saw a surface high that was in the Dakotas and far south central Canada that I think verified at something around 1,050 millibars. And I think it's kind of a cliched saying, like, these aren't your father's high pressure systems. You could go back and look at outbreaks in the 60s, 70s, and through the mid 80s. And I think what you'd find is that the high pressure was probably centered at more like 1060 or 1065 coming out of Canada. So yeah, you're seeing it in 850 temperatures. You're seeing it in the lack of strength of a deep Arctic high. So maybe under those circumstances, when it's quote unquote spent, right? When the cold is finally pushed all the way into the kind of the subtropical latitudes, in far southern Texas, and that quote unquote event is over. If there's nothing to fill that back in, the response at high latitudes, and like what you see reflected under the AO, it's rapid and quite severe.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point. But before we shift back, I know because we've got a couple scientists on the line here, Nat or Lynn or anyone. But do you guys, I don't know, anything jump out to you guys about this shift in the AO pattern?
I don't have any really any really good insights, but there's one thing that was a little curious. It's just so I recall that that ENSO has some relationship with the NAO, but I've seen studies suggest that there's a kind of a subseasonal shift in the relationship. So early in the season, like December, the response is different late in the season. So La Nina might be like weakly associated with, say, negative NAO in December, but then maybe more towards positive NAO February. So so it makes me think that I don't. It's not a strong relationship, but maybe and so maybe the base state was more becoming a little bit more conducive for this shift. So it's something. I don't think there's a low frequency explanation for this thing, but maybe in the low frequencies there's something that's priming the atmosphere that's making it more conducive for a positive shift to the AO. And maybe that was also, related to some of the changes we saw in the tropics that Dave mentioned earlier. So that's just one hypothesis, but I don't think that's
Hmm.
a sufficient explanation, just maybe a possible contributor.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and it's something that it might be worth being looked at as well, because we do see kind of some of those intraseasonal changes in kind of how the loading occurs under La Nina conditions. Rather, the La Nina is kind of a front end loaded winter, or kind of a middle back end loaded winter, and that's a little bit interesting because this winter the La Nina tended to peak earlier. We've seen kind of a slow drift towards a weakening La Nina signal in terms of kind of just maybe strictly the ENSO definition over the last 6 or 8 weeks. One more thing I wanted to mention, Dave, while we're on this topic, is that we can't forget either that, and I'm not saying this is directly related to the AO, but we kind of are at the very tail end where we've kind of exhausted, hemispherically, we've exhausted the influence of what was a fairly significant stratospheric warm event that occurred around the new year. And I think peaked maybe the first 4 or 5 days of January. So, we're kind of at that, very tail end of a time horizon, 6, 7, 8 weeks, so to speak. And obviously other things are happening simultaneously, right? This isn't the only forcing on the AO complex. But we're kind of at the very, we're petering out the influence of what might have been, or what the time was fairly strong stratospheric forcing.
Yeah.
So Dave, you want me to share again and go back to kind of thinking about kind of where we're at today and looking into mid-March?
Yeah, go for it, please.
Okay, here we go. So there's the verification, obviously, that we just witnessed. And in the near term, this week, we have a very sharp cold outbreak in the Northeast for these few days, but the rest of the country on balance is warm, and I attribute a little bit of that to kind of some shifting wavelengths. Of course, as we progress towards spring, some of those tend to shorten up, and you can get these kind of short-lived cool downs like we're seeing in the Northeast presently. But looking forward in this forecast, and I'm going to go back to and I keep banging on this because I think it offers some nice explanation as to kind of where we are now and where we may be going. But right now I'm going to put my cursor back here. This is kind of where we're at, or where we've been the last few days, which is the reestablishment of the convection over the far Western Pacific. It's not reflected really in a Wheeler-Hendon view, and that's why I didn't show that, but it's much more reflective of this kind of 200 millibar velocity potential, in that you've got the convection sitting in the far Western Pacific and over Indonesia, much more favorable towards like that La Nina environment. We obviously see that progress next week. We're probably looking at forecasts next week that will verify quite warm again, with a large surge in the eastern half of the country. But I want you to notice that kind of what happens out here going towards mid-March. And this is the European ensembles. We're seeing similar forecasts from the GFS ensemble. We're seeing similar forecasts from the CFS as well, which is a kind of a breakdown of the Westpac Indonesia connection. And you're seeing it split into 2 fragments. One is a piece of convection which accelerates towards South America and the Atlantic, and another emergence of convection from that Rossby wave over the continent of Africa and the Indian Ocean. So that when we're into the forecast period that we're interested for the predictions we made today, we're looking at something that is much more favorable towards convection that is far different than what we're witnessing today. This may or may not offer some clues as to the forecast. Other things obviously can be happening, but I think what we may be migrating towards is something that is a much more muted warm signal, if not an outright cold signal. So I think one of the challenges going forward today is, similarly to how we made forecast on the 9th of February, in the middle of a cold outbreak, looking towards something that was probably less cold, but we didn't know. Today, we're sitting here looking at a forecast that right now is verifying warm. We're looking at warm forecasts, let's say the next 10, 12, or 13 days, and wondering, well, what lies beyond that? And I think sometimes it's always that opaque window that lies out in that late week 2, week 3 timeframe that the models may not offer a lot of great clues. So we look towards other things in the atmosphere that may be helping to drive things. So to me, this was a little bit of a word of caution today, making my forecast. This was maybe a bit of a guide towards, say, let's try it for something that's less warm than what we're experiencing the next 10 days. My gut was telling me to go with something much colder, but obviously we don't know how cold, right? Mid-March is a very different animal than mid-February. In February, we're looking at expansive snow cover. Now we're looking at snow cover that's in retreat. And in fact, snow cover that looks like it won't be a factor at all the next, say, 12 or 13 days. So snow cover is going to retreat dramatically. We don't know how quickly we'll replenish source regions for cold. And from a modeling standpoint, the atmosphere doesn't really look that great, right? It looks like a relatively warm forecast. So the easy forecast to make today is, I think, just continuation of warmth. And Dave, I don't mind if you want to take it over again. We can look at where people's forecasts lie and talk about this a little bit, because I think it's reflected in some of the numbers I saw before we jumped on the call.
Sure. Let's see here. There you go.
Great.
Scroll up a little bit.
Yep. So that's perfect. So I think that, we have a bit of a smattering of forecasts. Dave, you're one of the coldest. I know Matt Rogers was there with you at 100. I actually was going to pick on you, Dave, to make a comment on your forecast, because you're colder than the 10 or 20-year average. You're colder than what the consensus looks like. Can you talk about maybe the rationale behind what you were thinking to go with a forecast that was away from the warm leaning? And I would constitute a warm looking forecast as something that was maybe like 90-ish or sub 90 HDDs. The 10-year normal is 92. The moving averages, the 5, 10, and 15 movers are roughly 90-ish. So anything below 90 to me is still a continuation of warm. You went with 100. Any thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of my my strategy, my rationale, it's not super scientific, but I try to keep it objective as much as possible, and kind of test different objective weighting schemes. And if I go kind of off that, if I add a fudge factor, I try to do it for like a really what I think is a good reason. I try to spell it out. So I guess in today's forecast, so certainly what I've seen over the last couple of weeks is that cold fudge factor no longer works, right? Like there's I don't see that justification anymore. Obviously, my most recent forecast really got blown up, and I don't see the mechanisms that potentially drove that cold that cold skew to reemerge. On the other hand, though, I also didn't see necessarily things go in the other direction. So I understand why sort of there's a feeling of warmth, in terms of looking at the maps and such, and obviously seeing a big change from where we've been. But then I also look at things like I don't I weight into my scheme the ECMWF and the CFS, which you can see here, right? And they're obviously cooler than the 30-year norm, and you can see that also on the Maxar page. And I take in consideration our sort of MJO input, right, which was at 99. And beyond that, I also just try to think about things experientially, and I guess just trying to leverage my knowledge of whatever that is of the weather. And I know. Let me just pull up this chart, right? So sometimes you just don't want to the MJO input is an index, and sometimes, and it's a statistical kind of scheme, and so sometimes you get into weirdness if there's small sample size issues, things like that. But like right now, I think the MJO is kind of like somewhere out here. It's kind of making a hard hook. There's the one of the latest forecasts, so it's kind of out here. It's expected to move off to the left. And when I look at the things from just an MJO perspective, obviously there's other factors. It leans slightly cool here. So that MJO input, I think, is broadly consistent with what I see here. And then I also think about even like what's going on in the 1 to 5 day period, right? Where, well, all of us can attest to. I think most of us on the call are in the Northeast, and we know it's cold outside today. And looking at the 1 to 5 day, and I know it's not from a broad HDD perspective, it's not super cold, but there's still these pockets of cold coming down and things like that. So the bottom line was, I didn't feel, even though I saw that there's a broad range of forecasts here, if I sort this, that are probably warmer. Yeah, where am I? So I'm here. So more forecasts are warmer than me. I went against my sort of the what's the word? Like I felt like there's this pull, this gravity of the consensus maybe to go warmer, but I didn't feel like I had really a sound. I didn't feel like I had enough to go there beyond what my sort of weighting scheme showed. So that's where I'm at today.
Thanks, Dave. And the reason I picked on you too was two reasons. One, you actually said what I thought you'd say, and I'm glad you did. But you were also one of the coldest, human forecast. You and Matt. And I want everyone to recognize what Dave was sharing was, some of his statistical thoughts on, where the MJO is, and he's also kind of giving you this it's a bit of an intuitive, based on experience, seeing these kind of things before, element to that. And I think that as forecasters in the subseasonal, we recognize that the numbers alone may not tell the whole story. And so what I got a sense from Dave, and Dave, correct me if I'm wrong, is you said there's a gravity towards pulling you to the warm direction, but you feel like there's maybe some factors that just aren't quite adding up in that direction. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that kind of art form, the rather subjective view, it sometimes makes people uncomfortable, but it's something that comes from experience. It's something comes from making and missing a lot of forecasts. It comes from making and seeing forecasts verify and watching weather patterns play out. And I think Dave even alluded to kind of just in his experience, and that's somewhat valuable. I'll share with everyone, what I shared with our trading team this morning. And I said that here, I'm just going to read it close to verbatim. I wrote that major teleconnections, the AO, the NAO, the EPO, at the end of model space, all side in the warmer direction, in a view that really doesn't challenge the prevailing narrative over the next, say, 10 or 12 days. I did say, however, and this kind of goes into what Dave was saying, that the mild signals do break down a bit. We have MJO forcing logs that are growing over the Indian Ocean, and some hints. And they're obviously stronger right now from the European model. And we have some data here to back that up, but we have some hints from the European model that suggest a colder move as we go in towards mid-March. So there's a bit of an intuitive element to that as well, which regards to, I see these things that are occurring in model space. And I looked at like the CPCs in a very warm place for weeks 3 and 4. And it's just one of those, this is a challenging forecast. And I didn't go nearly as cold as Dave. I'm at 94.5. I wanted to keep it maybe near or a little bit colder than the long-term average. I think I'm at the 30-year moving average. But my communication with the team here this morning was that the prevailing view, I would call it like a sentiment. The sentiment in the marketplace is going towards a very mild March. And obviously that's playing out well early on. And I wanted to offer this up to you. And we tend to couch this in terms of what we think the percentage risk is. But we thought that there's a move towards potentially colder mid-March, or at least away from the prevailing sentiment towards something that's more bullish. This isn't that fun to talk about in March. It's much more fun to talk about in December, January, and February. But nevertheless, there's still some meaning. And I think a forecast like Dave's that verifies near 100 will look to the marketplace like a lot colder than what they perhaps imagined looking into mid-month. Does anyone have any kind of questions where we're at? Because I think Dave and I have talked about some industry things too. And if nobody is, if we're missing people on kind of the verbiage we're using, or kind of like why we're saying certain things, please ask the question. We're happy to.
I had a question. So if I'm understanding Dave's forecast correctly, and Dave, correct me if I'm wrong here, you're kind of seeing things a little bit experientially, intuitively, whatever word you want to use. Is there any way someone without that experience would be able to see that without having to make, a risky assumption, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but might not be something someone newer would want to do?
That's a great question. Dave, can I answer that? Because I think I've covered this recently with some people on our team here. That's a great question, by the way. Let me answer this in 2 parts. One thing that you will try to come with as a young forecaster is you're coming up with your own forecast. You have your own justification, you have your own rationale, and you make your own prediction. The one thing that you're also trying to do in an industry like we work in is trying to gauge the sentiment of where other people lie. And that's sometimes easy to do in a format like we're doing right here, because you're getting to see, a dozen or more forecasts. But when you don't have access, like for instance, if you're in the industry that I'm in, you don't have access. I just can't call up a competitor and say, what are you forecasting? Please share that with me. But you tend to get a sense of sentiment from what maybe public vendors are. You get to see forecasts that are maybe a reflection of what someone's posting on Twitter. There's an amazing amount of information that's free. So you're making two things. You're making your own forecast and you're getting a sense of the sentiment. And the sentiment is a little bit of a vague concept, but you get some, that firms up as you start to see a little bit of data. And I'm not talking about needing 20 years of experience. I'm thinking you need like, months to a year of experience. It happens quite quickly in terms of how you get the sentiment right. The one thing that I was taught as a young person was to look at my forecast and then ask the question, well, make the statement, I know this forecast won't verify. And when this forecast doesn't verify, how badly will it look? Which direction will it go in, right? That's a very early, it's an early, I don't want to say it's not a trick, but you're asking yourself, if when this goes wrong, which direction does it go in and why maybe, right? What are the other alternative scenarios? Because sometimes those are challenging to imagine. We put all this work into creating a forecast. We think we have very good rationale, and it is good rationale. It is rooted in data that we're seeing. But stepping back from that sometimes and saying, what's going to go wrong and how will this miss? Is something that I did when I was a lot younger. And now that tends to happen kind of much more as like part of the process, if that makes sense. But when you ask yourself those questions, you're forcing yourself to say, if I didn't have any of this information, if I didn't know what the NAO forecast was in 2 weeks, if I didn't know what CPC was predicting, if I could just see a very bare bones, kind of broad level model overview, say of the next 7 days, what would I be predicting for 7 days beyond that, or 14 days beyond that? And so you're kind of stripping away some of what helped make the forecast, looking at it from a high level and asking what might go wrong. Does that make sense? I have to explain it in maybe a bit of a, we'd have to do a practical example of making a forecast without some of those tools, and then making you justify why your forecast may be wrong and how wrong could it be.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Thank you.
Sure. Dave made a comment. This really stuck with me, Dave. We about 4 or 5 weeks ago, we were at the precipice of looking into a cold window, and I forget the forecast. We could go back and look it up. Dave made a forecast that his gut was telling him to go colder, and the data still really wasn't quite supportive of that. Dave had one of those moments, I think, that comes from a lot of experience, which he's like, I've seen this before, and this just doesn't feel right. That to me was Dave's asking the question of, I can make a forecast that looks like quote unquote consensus, but if I'm going to make a forecast that is, if I think my forecast is going to miss, which direction is going to miss it? And his comment, I remember, I would love to have had it verbatim, because it stood out to me on the call when he said, I just have a gut feeling that this could go a lot colder. And wow, was he right? It was just one of those moments. And I think that to get to some of that ability to do that isn't as difficult as it seems. And you don't have to be as old as someone like Dave, but you're just saying, I think my forecast could be wrong. We'll put it this way. I know it will be wrong. And when it is wrong, here's how it will be wrong.
Yeah, that makes sense to look at it that way from, since these are so far out forecasts, pretty impossible to be 100% right from that distance. That's an interesting way to, I never really kind of thought to look at it that way before. So that's an interesting way to look at it, and really makes sense to look at it that way, especially when clients are going to ask you those kinds of questions anyway.
Let me frame this another way. This is actually something that I still sometimes will do. In today's day and age, Dave could probably, Dave remembers a time when this was true. In this day and age, it's very easy that you go to work, and the first thing you might do is look at the summation of, say, the next 15 days. You can immediately jump to hour 360 of the euro. You can look at all the things down the road that, it's like, well, look at that, warm up, look at that ridge, look at that cold outbreak. I see the operational models, and your attention gets immediately drawn to something that is of very low skill. One way that forecasters were trained a number of years ago, before he had immediate access to all this information, would be if all you knew was, say, the next 5 or 7 days of global weather, things like the MJO, things like just the modeling, right? If I could only see 7 days of the Euro, find a point, stop there, say day 5, hour 120, and ask yourself, if that's all I knew, MJO to that point, the 500 millibar pattern to that point, the stress for warming or not warming to that point, use the tools that are obviously at our disposal, right? We can use AAM, and just stop at that point and say, I'm going to only use this data and make a forecast for 10 days in the future, right? It seems archaic to do that, but what you're doing is you're training your mind to think away from the low skill data and look at much more of the high skill data to try to make a low skill forecast, right? This is a challenge behind Subseasonal, right? We look at the lowest skill data to make a forecast that is already going to verify at a relatively low rate anyway. So in a sense, you're doing a little bit of like brute force machine learning with your mind by saying, well, I only have some short-term data. And if that's all I had, what would I do? I know what's happened up to this point, and I should maybe see 7 days. I'll give you 7 days of model data. And then that's it. Let's make our forecast from that. That's a way to maybe give yourself an alternative scenario. Dave, anything on this?
No, I mean, I think there's a lot of great information there. Thank you for also the kind words, but I just to elaborate a little bit on what Dave was saying in terms of sort of, I guess, what caught my attention a few weeks ago, because, and I bring this up because I think there's an opportunity to further study it, and we've got some great scientists on the line, and not that anyone's going to go back today and do it, but just to share, because there's something there, and it's experientially, but I would love if I had more time or someone else had more time to investigate to see if there really is a bias. I think more than anything, there were kind of two things that jumped out a few weeks ago. But the one thing was that and again, I don't remember the exact details, but something where the MJO was kind of located here, and that it was projected to move almost like in a beeline up toward phase 6, 7. And along with that, caught my attention. But along with that when I looked at the velocity potential, the SPCZ was really starting to light up. So like out here, in fact, I guess we could probably go back. We don't have to do this now, but anyway, it takes a while. I don't even know if we can go back. Yeah, so something like that, right? And those were the things that caught my attention. That just, as Dave said, past experience said to me, I've been burned. Probably, honestly, that's why it stuck. Like, trying to forecast warm or not so cold in situations like that, where the pattern I felt like, or like from my memory, which is only so good, went in a significantly different direction, right? And so, again, if I had the chance to spend some resources on investigating this, I would, a lot of work's been done. I mean, we got people on the line like Nat, and I've, obviously we've got the MJO progression chart where we've looked at, the relationship with MJO in a particular phase or a lag relationship and stuff, which I think is really, really useful. But it might be interesting. What I'd love to see is look at that subset. Granted, there's going to be a smaller sample size, but where we see situations like that, where we see more of an explosive turn of the MJO in phase 6, 7. And what was the model response to that? Was it good? Was it bad? Now, obviously, my hypothesis is that there was significant error, and that the bias was more so toward missing the cold, the warm bias. So that was just, anyway. I just wanted to elaborate because that's what we do here, right? We share our theories and stuff, and that's my theory, and I don't know if it's right.
Dave, let me chime in on one more thing, just so nobody makes the mistake that Dave and I are like just two Neanderthals that look at weather like we looked at it in 1990. What we're talking about here with our mind is you're, in a sense, you're doing a poor man's machine learning. up until a point where machine learning, which is showing a lot of promise, can do these kinds of things, right? Machine learning right now is struggling because it's doing it's in a way, it's not its own fault, right? Like it's hard to make a good day 16 prediction when day 15 has such low skill. But we'll find a sweet spot where we can make maybe a better day 16 prediction by better predicting day 4, for example. I don't know if that's going to happen, but like I'm throwing it out there. I'm just kind of talking off the top of my head at this point. But you know, we're doing, in a sense, you're seeing forecasters trying to make better forecasts by kind of just going through that process that, you know, machine learning is going to take over and be able to kind of crunch a lot more of this data. Right now, it's not really capable of doing that because it's kind of working in a low skill environment to begin with, right? So it's flushing out, it's trying to flesh out signals that where there kind of are no real good pre-existing signals. But that as a side, that's going to change a lot, hopefully in the next, 5 or 10 years. And you'll be able to match the two. The marrying of those two will be really powerful, I think, and will really kind of maybe, launch these forecasts. The other thing I want to point out too is that one of the challenges of what we do here is we're doing a little bit of gamesmanship in this contest as well, right? Like you're trying to make better forecasts, and you don't always go. Like my gut would say that Dave wanted to go with like a really cold forecast, and he kind of hedged it and went like kind of cold. It's still, the verification looks spectacular against everyone else. Is that right, Dave? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Yeah,
But-
no, I think that's fair. Something like that. Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And that in lies like maybe my last comment for the day, and I'll get off my soapbox, and I'm only getting one a month, so I'm going to use it all to, to my benefit. But one of the difficult things I think people are finding, and I find this because I'm not usually forecasting in this format. So I look at my verifications, I'm like, these don't look very good. Over time, we are challenged as human forecasters by recency, and recency has been not a great tool to make future predictions, as I think a lot of us have learned over the last couple of years. Right, we're really, the big boat anchor in our mind is not just recent errors, but recent weather patterns. And overwhelmingly, the last 6 years, recent weather patterns have been mild. It's been really a very long haul to try to forecast cold and get cold, because probably from our standpoint, in my business, you're wrong 80% of the time in forecasting cold. So the boat anchor says, don't do it. And we're very much governed and weighed down by that. And that's what makes somewhat of what we do a big challenge, because you have that recency in your mind, not just what you missed last week, the week before that, but how the last couple of seasons have stacked up and what have they told you. So that's just one more challenge that the human forecaster has.
Hey, Dave, can I throw out one more question?
Sure.
For you, but also again, in particular, all our researchy people on the line. Something you said just made me think about this a little bit. I know, I know we've talked about, that there's a common knowledge that the models, ensemble models, are under dispersed, right? There's a common knowledge. But where I personally where the limits for me beyond that are, like quantifying that. And like, I can't, is it 20, 30%, 40%? And then beyond that, and this is my real question too, in particular, again, for anyone, but for some of our scientists here, have we looked at quantifying that under dispersion as a function of, different pattern situations, whether it be climate, like La Nina versus El Nino, AO versus this or that, or, things like that?
Yep. So I'll be happy to share,
Yeah.
Dave, that we have looked at the under dispersion problem. We have not bracketed it by weather regime. We've bracketed it just by season, cold season, warm season. We don't have enough La Ninas in our database, or El Ninos for that matter, to feel like we come up with something significant. I will say this, beyond day 10, and if you look at the highest and lowest ensemble members. So for example, if a forecast in, I don't know, North Jersey, next week, the dispersion, maybe the warmest forecast is 70, and the coldest high temperature, maybe 50. That's something that we see at, say, like, let's just take day 10 as a snapshot. The actual number is verifying outside of that max and min about 25% of the time in the cold season, right? So a quarter of the time, the verification is beyond the warmest or colder than the coldest ensemble member was, which
Wow.
is remarkably bad. But nevertheless, that's where we're at.
Wow. Okay.
And that's for, you know, like a sample of like large population centers in the Midwest and Northeast.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it
Sure.
would be
Is
interesting
it
to kind of
better?
bracket that out by maybe weather regime, positive NAO, negative NAO, et cetera, et cetera. That would be another kind of good natural next step to that.
How about in the summer? Since you brought that up, like, can you
Yeah.
share?
So in the summer, it's not quite as bad, but
Uh-huh.
the challenge is it's, it's still a big deal from an energy demand standpoint, right? You know, if it's, if the dispersion, say, is in New York City is 90 to 100 and the mean is 90, if it
Uh-huh.
verifies 95, it's a significant move in demand on cooling load for the United States. So, you know, the misses aren't as strong in the summer, but they still occur, and they're still, I want to say it's around 15% of the time we're above and beyond the warmest or colder than the coldest. I'd have to look that up. I didn't want to say it's like 12 to 15% maybe. I have to see. So, you know, a little more than 1 in 10 days.
Okay.
At day 10, I'm talking. It's still a big miss.
Yeah.
Thanks for letting me kind of take the floor today and just kind of go off on some of these topics that are.
Yeah. I think it's been great. I mean, we only have a minute left, but does anyone else have any parting thoughts? All right. Good.
Hey, and by the way, not just thank you, but if I know, you know, Zach had reached out to me about doing this, and you have my email. Zach has my email. If anyone had any questions about what we talked about today, or was confused about something, or want to challenge me on something, please email me. Happy to engage in discussion and talk about this.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much, Dave.
You
Yeah,
bet.
thank you. Yeah, that was great.
Thanks.
Much.
All right, bye, guys.
Bye.